Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the New Earth Leadership Summit, inspiring spiritual entrepreneurs like you to step into their personal power so that they can become the leaders of New Earth. And with me today, I have Dr. Megan Rose. She has a doctorate in East-West psychology from the California Institute of Integral Studies and a master's degree in religion and in society from the Graduate Theological Union. She is also an initiated ceremonial magician, a Shakta Tantric practitioner, and a senior seer in the House of Brigh Faery Seership Institute. She also serves as an ordained interfaith minister and a psycho-spiritual counselor, and is the executive director of the Entheosis Institute. And also she is the author of Spirit Marriage. Welcome to the show, Dr. Megan.
Hi, Therese. Wonderful to be here.
Clearly Spirit is happy for you to be here too. There's a celebration outside my window.
The honking of the horns.
The honking of horns, she is here.
I arrive with trumpets.
You do. So this, your background is amazing. And there's so many layers to it. And we were talking before we got on camera about how, I'm reading your book and there's so many amazing stories. You actually interview quite a few different people as part of your book, Spirit Marriage. But before we get into that, I wanted to ask you to share your story with us. How did you become Dr. Megan Rose? What's the story?
Oh, gosh. Oh, just that little tiny nugget.
Yeah, that little piece.
I'll give you the Reader's Digest version. So
okay.
I was raised in the Pentecostal Christian tradition. So laying on of hands, speaking in tongues, those are the waters I swam in growing up as a child. And that was, those were practices that were very alive and very integral to my spiritual evolution. But I found really early on that I could have some of those same ecstatic Pentecostal type experiences out in nature just as easily as I was having them in the church service. So that was really interesting. And as I matured and became a little disenchanted with more fundamentalist forms of Christianity, I began to search. I began to look for other forms of spirituality that really had that sort of somatic or embodied presence of the living divine, both within and without. And along that way, I went to seminary, to the Graduate Theological Union, to try and study this sense of like embodied spirituality. Spent a lot of time in the women's spirituality department there, and then after graduating from seminary, I went through some very powerful and what they call the dark night of the soul years. And coming out of that, I realized that I needed some really good psycho-emotional, physiological modes for healing some of that trauma. And I began to study alternative health, holistic healing, variety of different modalities, from Chinetsang to shiatsu massage to craniosacral therapy, and then into like a clinically certified hypnotherapist and those sorts of more esoteric forms. And eventually that path really rekindled my early childhood spirituality, but outside of the auspices of religion. And I began to have experiences with spirit guides and spirit presences that led me into my current research, which is on spirit marriage. And I basically decided to go back and do my Ph.D. to really understand it, both from a cultural and historical level, as well as a psycho-spiritual level. And so I really entered that research as a practitioner scholar. So somebody who was both studying, but also doing the practices. And that led to me writing a book about it.
And it's an amazing book. I can't wait to. So it's available right now, right? You can get it on Amazon easily, or Barnes and Nobles, anywhere else.
All of the places.
All the places, guys, you can find this book. And it is a really, it's beautiful. I love how you blend in so many traditions and you take us on a path and a journey to understanding this, because a topic like spirit marriage can be seen as like really outside the realm of understood, but it actually has quite a long lineage in history.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah, I mean, most of us already know about a spirit marriage. We just don't think of it that way. For those of us that are familiar with Christianity, the virgin birth is very much about, and the subtitle of my book is Intimate Relationships with Otherworldly Beings. And so it's the idea that we can step into these deeply bonded intimate relationships. And intimacy can look a lot of different ways. So I'm not just talking about eroticism. We're talking about all different forms of devotional embodied spirituality. But yeah, so the Virgin Mary and the tradition of nuns marrying Jesus.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, so I talk about that. And what I tried to do was give like a historical context. So the book is in 3 parts. Part 1 is sort of, here's the historical, mythological, anthropological accounts of this that date back all the way to like ancient Mesopotamia and the Sumerian sacred marriage. And I think that the practice predates that, but those are like the first recorded records we have. And then the bulk of the book is this part 2, which is the present. And I went and interviewed 9 different practitioners in a variety of different traditions to try not to synthesize things, but to show the variety, but also some of the similarities that crop up when people are stepping into this practice. And really, I focused on interviewing people who had been in a marriage for an extended period of time and who were leaders, spiritual leaders in their community. So there was a grounding and a sense of like really embodied presence and deep wisdom tradition that came out of those interviews. And then the last part 3, is the future. What are the practices? What are the things that arise out of all of this learning, and where do we go with this, and how do we cultivate this for ourselves? And that's really where the entheosis piece comes in, is in part 3.
I am so excited to talk about the entheosis part, because I feel like it's going to really help us understand it in the context of this new earth leadership that I keep talking about with people. But before we go to that part, you keep using the word embodied. I love that. So in terms of, so many questions coming up at once. First, it seems to me that as a child, according to the story in your book, you moved into embodiment quite quickly. You share a story about being an infant with a rare disease, and almost, let you share that story, because it's pretty powerful.
Yeah. So, it's interesting. I was less than a year old, and I had a deformity in between my kidneys and my urethra, and I was constantly chronically sick. And so they had scheduled me to go in and have surgery to kind of correct this. And my family, being Pentecostals and coming from that faith healing tradition, decided that they were going to pray over me and try to use that power, that potency of the Pentecostal, really of the Holy Spirit, which later on, I would understand through the lens of the goddess, the divine feminine. But at that time, it was just this sort of the Holy Spirit. What is that? Well, it's, you can ask a Christian what the Holy Spirit is, and you'll get, ask 10 different Christians what the Holy Spirit is, and you'll get 10 different answers. So in any event, I was an infant, I was sick. They anointed me with oil and prayed over me. And we're talking about like my mom, my grandmother, my aunts, and the minister. So all these adults are laying on of hands and praying this Holy Spirit fire into my body. So I was healed, but I was also really altered from a very young age, meaning I had this tremendous amount of fiery, what later on I would sort of understand as Shakti, or the divine feminine energy, just coursing through my body, which made me very psychically open and very sensitive, which has got its benefits and its challenges.
Right.
And, but I also was just this kid who had this profound spiritual experience before I could even talk, and therefore looked at the world through this sort of like spirit-filled lens. And I talk about in the book how I took on the mantle of ministry from a very early age and was trying to tell everybody about this powerful spiritual energy that I was like, through my body all the time.
That's amazing, because my own experience, and I've shared this with other people too, is So it seems like embodiment was something that just, you got it, like barely even a year old, and you're already like embodying this energy. When I work with other spiritual people, and my own journey as well has been, I don't like this place, I'm going up in energy, I'm going to go over to that realm now and hang out there. And so part of my own journey is to figure out how, like, I'm supposed to be here, you got to bring it down.
Yeah. You know, I won't say that I lived in embodied spirituality for the remainder of my life. I think that, you know, especially during those years where the dark night years, I really tried to distance from my body, and I wasn't practicing any sort of spirituality during those years as well. And then sort of later on in life, it was about integrating, because even though I was having that strong embodied spiritual experience from an early age, the church that I was in was still very much about up and out, still very much about like, ignore the body, ignore everything below the neck.
Right.
And, you know, it's all about God up there, and the body is a bad thing. So, but I had, you know, I had my own experience of that because of how I had that healing as a child. And then also being out in nature was very much about embodied practice. So yeah.
So let's talk about, because I feel like the book, it leads us to embodiment, right? We're working into embodiment when we work through the material.
Mm-hmm.
And I just want to have a discussion. Why is it important? Why is embodiment important?
Because this is where it's all happening, folks. I mean, it's happening in the body, it's happening on the planet. And as much as we would like to be in, some of us would like to be in a sort of non-physical, spiritual, ideal, you know, kind of heaven type ascended energy, that's not what we signed up for if we're in a physical body right now.
Are we signing up to bring it in, that energy, bringing that in?
I personally think that we signed up to bring it down and in and up and out and down and in and up and out. And it's the weaving, or if you look at some of the sacred geometries, it's this toroidal sphere.
Yes.
Right? So it's not just about going up and out, which is most of the sort of masculinist spiritualities are really about going up and out, right? The body is bad, and so we want to go into the cosmos where everything is fine and good and lovely, which, side note, it's not necessarily.
Right.
And the down and in, or the underworld, or the embodied, or, you know, all of these things that have caused for women and earth-based or indigenous spiritualities to be sort of suppressed or marginalized or persecuted, right? Because those spiritualities tend to be embodied spiritualities that are very connected to earth. And frankly, if we're going to move into this idea of a new earth, right, we have to understand that we are in relationship to earth, right? Earth is not something, all of what we see in our current culture, the deforestation, the climate change, all of these different extractive processes are because that we have lost our relationship with our bodies and earth. Because if we loved earth and if we loved our bodies, we would not exploit each other or the planet the way that we are exploiting things. But to love our bodies, to love earth, we have to first come into wholeness and love within ourselves, right? That's one of the greatest obstacles, is to really be able to step into a kind of new earth culture. It kind of begins at home with who you are being as an individual.
I love that. It's so resonant, so true. And when you were talking, I saw the torsion field you were talking about, but I'm also seeing like the Star of David or the Philosopher's Diamond, right? The blade and the chalice. And it's like they kind of hid the chalice, right? And so we were missing a piece for a while.
Yeah.
I mean, it's still out there. There's still still cultures that are embodying that, but where this is coming back. So, or are we here now, of course, the divine feminine, the return of that divine feminine energy and understanding.
And the divine other, right? Because that it's not just about this binary of male, female. It's about like the totality or the inclusivity of all the different fluidic ways in which we move in and out. And that's really where our conversation with otherworldly beings come in, because that otherworldly beings, whether we're talking about deities or angels or elementals, etc., and ancestors, maybe not ancestors in the case of binary, because usually ancestors had a gender that they identified with, although we will increasingly see a growing number of non-binary ancestors, you know, as we progress. And there have always been, you know, trans and non-binary people. Any event, the spirit realm doesn't play by the binary polarities, and I talk about this in the book, that humans do by and large. And so when we move into relationship with the other world, you know, whether it is this upper world, the underworld, or the various strata of the surface world, and I'm including the plant, mineral, and animal realms. They're part of our world, but they have their own cosmologies that they're in their own intelligences. So when we realize that we as humans species are but a conversant, we're in conversation with, we're not the most, one could argue that we are not the most advanced of species on this planet, nor are we the most important of species on this planet, right? Like the planet would probably keep trotting along fine without humanity, but take away the bees and it's toast, right? So once we step out of that mentality that we are the most important and that our evolution is the most important, and we step back into a softened, more conversant or conversational relationship with the world, the various strata of intelligence at many, many different levels of being, I think we start stepping into more of that vibration or that frequency of new earth, because it's a relationship, right, with each other, with earth, with Gaia.
So we drop hierarchical structures as we enter new earth energy.
Yeah.
Does the structure itself do we start to almost make the torsion field in our relationship to each other? Is that how you see it?
That's an interesting observation. I hadn't thought of it that way, but yeah, I mean, if you think about some of the intimacy practices, right? So my background is in Shakta Tantra, right? And we're working with down and in and up and out and around and that toroidal. But then when you step into relationship with another person and you're doing that together, right? And then you create, and it's like, you know, the holacracy model of just, you know, nested within nested fractals that are all doing this. And then I love, I believe it's Elizabeth Therese, the evolutionary biologist, who talks about the evolution of the caterpillar into the butterfly. And there's this point in that evolution where the individual, the imaginal cells of the butterfly that are emerging, right, they link together in chains with other imaginal cells, and they go stronger and stronger and stronger and stronger until the immune system of the caterpillar can no longer fight them off anymore, and that old paradigm dies, and those imaginal cells have sort of like linked together arm in arm and are like forming these powerful emergent this powerful emergent being. And that's certainly, you know, within the auspices of conscious evolution and Barbara Marx Hubbard's thinking and others in that realm, certainly their perspective on where we're headed and how we head there as a new earth. We link together with like-minded
Love that.
co-creatives.
Yeah, you're giving me such great visuals. Like I'm watching it in my mind and I'm like, wow, just imagine how powerfully quick things would shift. It would be so alchemical if we started taking that role together, if we started, right, seeing that interconnectedness, not just of humanity, but humanity with other species in the earth itself, in our cosmic place. And it's just, you see the fractal math start to take shape as it expands. So beautiful. And it feels Right. It feels because it's matching nature, right? That's
Yeah.
one of the things I always say is like, if I'm looking for sacred truth, I look at what are the patterns of nature? What does nature show me? Because that's the language of the universe right there.
Mhm,
And so
mhm.
if I can see that, if I can see the synchronicity in something that's happening, I can tell if it's natural. I can tell if it's of a divine order.
Yeah.
Um, and so I love that because it's like, the truth is right in front of us. Like you said,
Yeah.
it's like right out in the open for
Yeah.
us to see it.
Yeah. I mean, German forester Peter Wollebine wrote this great book called The Hidden Life of Trees. And he talks all about how in forestry, trees are these integrative organisms, right? So their roots are down in the earth and they communicate through the mycelial or the mushroom layer that is sort of like this brain or nervous system that helps the trees communicate. And when one tree is about to die and it can tell that it's like its life force is waning, it will actually download all of the information that it has collected through its life into that network, and the other trees will sort of uptake it. And the interesting thing is when a tree is chopped down and the stump is left, the rest of the trees around it continue. That tree can no longer source itself, right? It can no longer pull in the phytonutrients that it needs. And so the trees around it keep feeding that stump, even though it's been cut down and can no longer contribute, right, to the collective. They continue to feed the roots of the tree. And so it's never really entirely a dead organism. At least in that phase. And so I love that because, if we think, and also the thing is with trees, like they can't, they will grow like in clusters together, but so you'll have a group of like aspen or oak or whatever, but like they still support the other trees around them, even if it's not part of their group. And these mycelial networks and the root structures will extend for, large miles and miles, my understanding is. So I think that's a lovely example of like, what do we need to do as a culture and a species? We need to do like the trees do.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I mean, that's so resonant because the idea of my understanding of like how our consciousness is expanding, we're moving back to a understanding of collective consciousness where we really start to get, as the heart chakra is fully opening and we're connecting with one another, that when you win, when you get your needs met, I get my needs met. And it's that absolute intimacy understanding. And so when you're talking about the trees and how they're feeding one that can't feed itself, I'm like, they get it. They get it. They're already doing it. I
Yeah.
love that.
Yeah. And mother trees will adopt other trees. Like there's a mother tree that has its sort of other baby trees around it that it gave birth to. But if there are other trees in that collective that have lost a mother tree that aren't necessarily like the genus or species of that tree, it'll still source the other trees around it. It's a really beautiful way of looking at it. But the trick is we can look at all of this culturally, right? And we can say these are the things we should be doing as a culture. But until we step into personal transformative change, it is very hard to sustain cultures that are based on compassion and equality if the individuals within those cultures haven't done the work themselves and done the work on themselves. I love this quote by and this is sort of like leads into the entheosis conversation.
Okay.
Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "Our goal is to create a beloved community, and this will require a qualitative change in our souls and a quantitative change in our compassionate action." So the compassionate action piece is like, that's the social justice movements, that's the collectivizing and social care movement. And that's wonderful. But if people step into that without doing the commensurate work of healing their trauma and really know thyself, that whole maxim of personal development, then we end up with cultures that are just repeating those same traumas over and over again, right?
Yeah.
And so it's a both and if we're only just doing self-development work and sitting in a, on a mountaintop somewhere and completely divorced from what's going on, boots on the ground perspective, then we're not really, it's this sort of solipsistic existence, which isn't bringing in the new earth. It might be doing something else, but it isn't necessarily, through the context of trying to build a new earth, it's not actually building much. And there are some arguments that could be made that there are fields that are being held and gates that are being opened and spiritual work that's being done. But, by and large, for the average person, we need both. We need both the inner work, the qualitative change of the soul, and the quantitative change in our compassionate action as a collective. And so, I, in my research, have looked more, because I'm a psychologist, looked more at the personal change piece, although I've been involved in many different groups and circles talking about the sort of compassionate action piece. And that's sort of, my research right now has been about entheosis, which is entheos, or divine within, the innate divine, the innate spirit, that Holy Spirit, right, that was quickened in me as a child, is nascent in each of us. And we can step into knowledge and conversation with that aspect of ourselves, and bring it to the forefront. When I started doing this work 20 years ago, I had my holistic healing practice, and I really was interested in showing up for my clients with the highest and the greatest of myself. And that became a practice of sort of daily calling that divine part of me, right, that is me and also not me, to sort of like drive the ship, right, to sort of step into greater and greater capacity to show up as that part of me, just as my way of being in the world. Jung called it the individuation process. Aristotle called it the entelechy. There are, the true self, the divine self, there's a lot of different names for it, but it is that process of stepping into deep relationship and devotion with that part of you, and then really getting to know it so that it sort of seasons or flavors the totality of who you're being in the world.
I love that. And let me ask you for a distinction, because maybe there isn't one, maybe there is. With entheosis, so the embodiment of the awakening of the divine self, is the divine self the same as the term higher self, or are they actually two different layers?
Yeah, it's a good question. It depends on who you talk to. So if we're talking very Western esoteric theological models, the divine self is something, there's sort of the mundane self, and then the higher self, and the divine self sits above that. And the higher self is like this part of you that is the wise, loving, compassionate part of you. Sometimes it could be like a divine parent or a divine guide. The divine self is literally the archetypal divinity that you have come in to be a unique expression of. The way I like to describe it is, if we think of like the body of the divinity is back here, and then it gradiates down into incarnation, and then you're the fingertip of that god, goddess, deity, extending its finger into the world to like push particles around. And there might be other fingers, other people that are nested within that archetypal divinity. And I use archetype not to say that it is not an actual entity, but just that idea of, there are these collective deity consciousnesses which express uniquely in the different cultures that they manifest. So let's use a love goddess, right? There's like a love goddess archetype, which looks different when it's Lakshmi or Aphrodite or Ochun, or these different various ways that then culturally constellate around that. So, if you come in and you are holding a really strong vibration or ray of a love type goddess, or a warrior type goddess, or a wisdom type goddess, or god, or other, right? Because we're moving into the wibbly wobbly place of non-binary at that point. then that's what you get to know. That's what you step into devotion and relationship with, so that you can bring more of those qualities out of yourself and be a blessing, right? That's the sort of I think that's the sort of the core, the kernel of the vow of the Bodhisattva, right? Is to bring forth yourself as a blessing to the planet.
Oh, I love that. I got to write that down for all of everybody sitting here, but it's so good. All right. So let's talk about the process of entheosis. Can we talk about that? Can we break that down a little? Oh, I guess what I want to lead it to is, maybe let me backtrack. How would you define leadership, and how is that connected to entheosis?
Well, I think leadership is really about what you're taking, what you are taking, not only taking a stand for, but investing your consciousness in. Meaning, we've got lots of different narratives and lots of different perspectives. And we always have, by the way. I mean, it seems amplified now because of social media and the immediacy of information, but we've always lived on a planet where there's lots of different consciousnesses thinking lots of different things, sometimes totally wildly contradictory. So this is nothing new.
Right.
And so the idea of leadership is, this is what I stand for. This is what I am investing my one precious life, this incarnation, right? We may subscribe to the idea of past lives or future lives, grand, but this one precious life and incarnation, how are you going to use it? And a leader is someone who says, I'm going to use it consciously, and I'm going to use it for a new earth leader then would be using it for the building, the structure, the support of this idea of new earth. And new earth being a utopian vision, but not utopia as like a perfect world, utopia as a world that works for everyone, where everybody's basic needs are met, so that we can then live into whatever flavor of divinity we're here to express, right? And not all of them are like, like love goddess, right? Some of them are fierce, and some of them are tricksters, and some of them are, dealing with like the decomposition of things in the underworld. There's many, many different flavors of divinity. And the interesting thing, based on the research that I've done and the many traditions that I surveyed, is your divine self may not be the same for your whole life. So it can shift as you grow and evolve as a person. Your patron deity that you're working with may introduce you to another phase or another being that you work with, that you bring more of that flavor or that ray through. So it can alter throughout the life, and you can have more than one.
Yeah. No, that absolutely makes sense. For example, Isis was always very resonant with me. She always comes back around, a great teacher. But through her, the understanding of Sophia came through. And so those two feel like a star system to me. They're working in a similar energy, but different aspects.
Mm-hmm.
But I love that. And just one of the things that I love about what your work shows, but also that the cultures that have come before us and passed down their wisdom, they're always showing this. I don't know, maybe you can explain it better, but what I see is like you said, you use the metaphor of the fingertip and the arm, but what they show me is this field where it looks like one being on one level, but if you were to go up a level, you'd see multi-beings, and if you go up another level, you see like multi-beings, and it just keeps going like that.
Yeah.
That's what they show me. So can you explain, is there a term for that, what I'm looking at?
My understanding of what you're describing is that you're talking about the monad. So there is the individual consciousness that comes through with the little your natal chart when you're born. So there's like all these different influences, your epigenetic inheritance, your karmic inheritance, all these things that you kind of come through with when you're born, which are kind of like In some cases, they're boons, like they're things that help you out. And in some cases, they're challenges, things that kind of like you've got to work through. But everybody comes through with these. For the ceremonial magician, and to use a ceremonial framework for a moment, the great work is doing as much of addressing all of that so that you can step into this knowledge and conversation with the divine self as possible. And so everybody's got their sort of individual consciousness that they're working on. And this is where it's slightly different from, like, say, going back to when we were all in oneness. Like the human evolutionary trajectory of consciousness isn't that we want to go back into just mindless like oneness with everything. We actually evolved to a point where we evolved our individuality, right? We evolved into Homo sapien sapien. We want to hold on to that and move into a much more multi-layered and multivalent level of consciousness where we can be in conversation, where we can be the one and the many at the same time, or at needed moments, right? I'm in oneness consciousness, or I'm in my consciousness now doing my work, and then I'm moving out and working in the collective, and it's sort of this in and out sponda or pulsation. But
like the breath.
Yeah, exactly, like the breath, or like the seasons, of expansion and contraction. And so we have that individuated consciousness, which we're maybe we've taken on the trajectory of trying to be in that entheotic state or process with. But we also have this sort of soul group, right? That we are other souls that we've tended to incarnate with over and over again. And we, if we're lucky, we often, and sometimes if we're unlucky, we find them again, depending on the work that we've got to do with them,
Right.
So we'll find them again and do whatever we signed on to do in this lifetime. And then, there's sort of like the monad. And so I'm using the body again, but it's like the hands and then the monad. And then, you move back and back further, and there's like more and more intelligences, more and more consciousnesses that start joining or feeding into that. So in some ways, the incarnational process is this sort of winnowing down to a fine point, and then moving back out of that. And I think I would postulate that as a species, where we are going with our consciousness, as we're doing this sort of entheotic work and the other psychospiritual work that folks are practicing here in the 21st century, is the mastery of moving in and out of those states. You see it in the entheogen sacred medicine communities, moving into oneness in the medicine, and then moving, and that kind of back and forth. And I think when we get really good at our ability to recognize value and are adept at doing that, we'll see a more collective transformation.
Yeah, no, I can see that. I want to go back to entheosis in terms of leadership. So when I look at what you had said about leadership, about, what do I stand for? What am I going to consciously commit my energy to in this lifetime, this precious present moment? How does entheosis blend with that or take us to that?
Well, depending on the divinity that you're working with, we are talking about elevated or expanded consciousness that isn't bound by time space like physical human bodies are, and therefore give us that sort of bigger picture, right? The bird's eye view versus the boots on the ground. So entheosis allows us to be guided by a bigger perspective that even our wise self doesn't necessarily have access to. And it also invites us to devote ourselves to that big self, or that divine self perspective, which ideally, depending on the entity and the being that you're working with, is benevolent and loving and can see sort of the trajectory of where your community, your culture, the planet is going, and nudge us, right, in the right direction. And I will say that, and I write about this in my book, there are some pitfalls or some things that we need to be aware of when we start stepping into the conversation around the divine self or entheosis. And that is that, it doesn't make us, and particularly when you're also taking on a leadership position, right?
Okay.
So it's stepping into entheotic practice or knowledge and conversation with the divine self, etc., however you want to language that, doesn't make you special. It doesn't make you even necessarily right all the time, because that, discernment at any given moment is, and our ability to correctly discern is always at play. Mm-hmm. Is this my divine self, or is this just my ego, right? So we really have to be careful of self-aggrandizement. Well, I have knowledge and conversation of who my goddess is, and therefore I'm a goddess, and everybody should treat me like a goddess, right? Well, while you're treating everybody else like, they're your pawns or your subjects, right? So that kind of self-inflation energy, we have to really keep that in check. I think leaders really, leaders for, what Martin Luther King called the beloved community, right? That compassionate action are in service, right? They're in service to people around them. They're not lining up acolytes to worship them.
Yeah, you're reminding me of a message that came through. So I often share messages that come through from my team. And it was a couple of years ago, but they had talked about the inverted queen and how we're righting her now, where we're putting her in the upright position, but that the inverted queen, right, is the ruler who thinks everyone serves her, when the true queen is the one in service.
Yeah, absolutely. Who is tracking her community, who's tracking her, her subjects, if we're using that, that queen model, and interested and invested in their success.
Yeah.
And is, wholly devoted to that. So there's the self-aggrandizement piece. There's also the competition piece, my deity is better than your deity, or I've achieved level 5.
It's like my dad's better than your dad.
Or I've achieved level 5 of blah, 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 and therefore I'm so enlightened.
Right? Oh my goodness.
And so, we have to remember that even people we don't like have a divine self.
Yes.
They may or may not have signed on to get to know that being in this lifetime, but they're all there. And so we have to be very, very careful about, labeling and judging, and, lots of very relevant conversation to things that are happening right now culturally.
Right. So the ego always wanting to put things in a box, put them in order, make things right and wrong. And I love what you're saying, because the message is of unification. Yeah. And it's interesting because I think that anybody would fall into these pitfalls, this is just my opinion, probably don't have a unified self aspect, right? That they're still judging or holding in contempt or, pushing parts of themselves away.
Yeah. I mean, I also think that we go into and out of a unified self. It's not like we have this holy mountain moment and we see the divine self and then everything is just, hunky-dory. Right. Jack Kornfield says, after the ecstasy, the laundry. And, there's this idea that we have these peak experience moments or these unifying moments. And then we have many, many other aspects. I'm a big fan of Assagioli and parts dialogue. We've got all these other parts.
Yes.
Sometimes when we reach these peak moments is when those really hurting parts then come forward even stronger, because that there's some, oftentimes more capacity to address and see and deal with them. So we're always managing, as long as we're in a human body, we're managing all of these different various aspects and various agendas that we've got going on in our psycho-spiritual system. And what I'm simply proposing is that the entheosis process is setting your North Star to the divine self part of you and using that as a really powerful resource to soothe, heal, transform, inform the other parts of you that are all super valid and important, and part of being a fully fleshed out human being.
Okay, so a question for you. In the entheosis process, in your opinion, does the divine choose you, or do you choose the divine? Or is it sometimes one way or the other, or both? Like how is the deity coming
Yes.
forward?
Yes. I mean, I think that it's all of those. I don't think
All of them.
I don't think there's any one right or only way that it happens. I think that particularly for people who have deep devotional practice to a deity, that often lifetime after lifetime we incarnate devoted to that deity. Like I said, so, you know, 3 of the cultures that I talk about in my book that work very, very closely with entheosis type processes, they don't necessarily call them that, are the ceremonial magic, which I talked about, knowledge and conversation. They talk about the great work, which is learning the name. They call it the name, but it could be a sound or a vibration of your, what they call the holy guardian angel, which is essentially the divine self. And it's this whole ritualized process that the ceremonialist, the magician, works through to step into that kind of conversation, to get to know that part of them. There's the Shakta Tantric practice, which I think is pervasive in other tantric practices, and maybe in many forms of other forms of Hinduism. That is the Ishta Devi or Ishta Devata, which is the one's chosen deity. And it's sort of like not just the deity who's chosen you, but the deity who you choose to devote yourself to. And, you know, if you're familiar at all with the Indic traditions, the deity has hundreds, if not thousands, of permutations. So there's not just one Kali, right? There's many, many, many different faces of Kali. And you see that in some of the iconography where you see the face of the deity and then these thousands of or hundreds of faces around them. And that's like the many, many different flavors of deity. And then in that you could potentially be devoted to, and you've sort of got to find your one flavor, your one expression.
Yeah.
Or your group of expressions. And then I researched the Vodou tradition, the Haitian and New Orleans Vodou tradition, which is an African diasporic tradition that came out of the Middle Passage. And that tradition works with something called the Matet. And the Matet is like your patron deity or patron saint that is placed in the head. Like there's this ritual for bringing that deity down into the skull, or they're not called deities, they're called Loa, bringing that entity into resonance and into close proximity to the human consciousness, so that you can serve the community. That's one of the practices that's used for making a minister or mambo or ongan in those traditions. And so here we have different flavors of it culturally, but this same idea that we have this divine part of us that may have a very, you know, in the Loa, there's very specific Loa that you could potentially have as a Matet. You know, in the tantric tradition, there's more like, you know, hundreds of different deities. And then in the holy guardian angel, it's like, it could be, it's like a needle in a haystack. I mean, it could be any flavor that wanted to express for you. And you see that they can shift. The Ishta Devi can shift in life, the Matets can shift. So who am I in this given moment here? What flavor of the divine am I here to express? How do I express it as skillfully as I can to contribute then to this beloved community that we're here to be a blessing and a gift to?
Yeah, that's beautiful. That's so powerful too. I mean, I love how this information has been with us for so long too. I mean, I truly believe like we're not sent here without maps. That's one of my favorite things, is like looking for maps, like that the universe has left us maps to follow for, and it's our choice, of course. So we have the free will to follow the map or not. But it's so beautiful that you're helping to bring that work forward. I know it's out there, but it's great that you're creating like that bridge so that we can explore it even more. And thank you so much for connecting it to what leadership is in a higher vibration, and invoking that divine self and looking through the eyes of that divine self as how would it lead, and allowing it to. So what I see when you talk about it is I see like the human self, and then I see the leader emerge from us. And then in front of that, I see the divine leading the leader.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I love that. It's giving me chills. So I want to talk more about, actually, before we do that, I love asking this question. It's a hard one to answer, but I love the answers people bring forward. So my question to you is, what is one tangible step that you believe anyone could take to help start this process of creating New Earth?
Yeah, I mean, recognize that you have a divine self and that it is actionable.
Ooh, yeah.
Right? It's not just some concept that's out there, but that you can actually take action to get to know that part of you.
And when you say it's actionable, is that like what we were talking about by being led, or is there more to that? Is there a deeper form of action it can take?
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of, like we just talked about with these 3 different traditions, there are a number of initiatory paths that one could undertake if you're drawn to a particular deity within a particular tradition. There's the more sort of hermetic path, which is a little more open, although they still work within certain cultural frameworks. And certainly my practice is designed around helping a more interfaith approach to. So looking at the spiritual technologies and understanding what these different spiritual technologies are doing, and then making it applicable to people who don't maybe necessarily feel drawn to one tradition or hold a few different traditions.
I was just going to ask if you feel like the initiation process is something that happens on a personal level, like a private level, or is it something that happens sort of in a context where you need maybe a guide with you to
It
create
depends on the
initiation?
initiation. I think there's definitely both. There are certain things that we're initiated into. My healing when I was a child, then being filled with the Holy Spirit, that was an initiation. Although it wasn't, it was sort of irrespective of any sort of initiatory process traditionally. But, and then there are specific initiatory processes that have a certain goal and a certain purpose within a certain group. And they're particularly for, whatever that set of coordinates around that initiation ritual really is. So we have both.
So when we're bringing forth the divine self, and let's say it's something like, let's say I read your book and it fills me up, right? And I'm listening to this and I'm like, I want that now. Is that an initiation process that I go through, or do I come to you as an example, as a guide or a teacher through that process?
Well, I would say that is a activation, right? When we're like quickened, right? We've been quickened or activated by something, and it's like there's something in our spirit that is like, ooh, yeah, I need more of that. And we sort of lean into that stream of wisdom or knowledge or experience. And as far as coming to me and working with me, I have a few different programs that I lead people through. I have an online group program where I teach, and people as a group and a community come together and talk about these things and support each other in a safe, private community. I have a course that people can do. It's a self-study course where people go through the spirit marriage material, and there's practices and there's a workbook, and that is, for people who kind of want to go at their own pace and take their time. I do one-on-one sessions with people. I mean, I have a variety of different ways that people can learn about this. And, a lot of it is setting the right foundation, right? Setting the right foundation for these experiences to happen. Because that my background is in ceremonial magic and Shakta Tantric and Faery Seership, those 3 traditions that I carry, inform and inspire a lot of what I teach. But and I do teach Faery, Seership, and ceremonial magic practices as part of my work. But the Shakta Tantra is sort of more of my personal private practice. So I'm not necessarily teaching Shakta Tantra, but it's like there because it's informing my magical body and what I'm doing and how I'm approaching kind of everything that I teach.
Fantastic. So you're, by working with you, people can start to lay that foundation.
Yeah. So I tried to write the book so that people can start just with the exercises in the book, right? And
Excellent.
you can get really far just doing those, I think there is like 6 or 7 different exercises in the book that talk about like, this is what you can do. And a lot of people will ask me, well, I don't have, going back to the idea of spirit marriage, well, I don't have a spirit that is wanting to marry me. And what I like to say is, no, but you have a divine self that you can get to know. And moving into a deep, intimate, bonded relationship with the divine self, I think, is a form of spirit marriage. Now, there are other people that will debate that with me for various reasons, but what I like to say is that when you're stepping into a bonded devotional relationship, whether you conceive of that as an entity outside of you, or whether you conceive of that as an entity within your own, in your own consciousness stream, you're still stepping into a relationship and you're still doing the kind of devotional ritual that, I talk about devotion, discernment, and discipline. You're still taking up the discipline, you're still learning to discern their voice, and you're devoting yourself to that work. And all 3 of those practices, which are what I teach my students, are translatable to either divine self or spirit marriage. Just depends on how you're grokking it, really.
Yeah, I mean, that absolutely makes sense to me. When I feel, I often refer to it as my higher self, but there is a private relationship and it's very much back and forth conversation that's going on. It absolutely feels like union.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, it totally resonates for me. So I want to share with everyone that you have a free gift that you're sharing with our viewers. It's a free masterclass. Can you share with us more about that?
Yeah, it's called Entheosis. Ta-da!
Ta-da!
No surprise there. But it's Entheosis, cross-cultural spiritual technologies for awakening the divine within. And those 3 traditions that I talked about, I go into much greater depth. It's got, a PowerPoint, so you get visuals for those of you that are visual and auditory learners. And it's about an hour-long class where I talk much more in depth and do a little ritual meditation at the end for people to come into an experience, right, of who their divine self is. And it's really just about stepping into the curiosity. Wow, what are the things in my life? And you can look at a lot of different systems. You can look at your astrological chart, the Enneagram. You can look at a lot of different spiritual systems that are out there to start getting a sense of like, oh yeah, I'm really embodying, or what are the things that you're drawn to in your life? What are the things that make your soul sing? All of those different things. It's unique to every person, and that all of those are little breadcrumb trails or little clues.
I love that. The maps that I was talking about. She's telling you about the maps that can show you. I'm so excited to go look at my own maps and see like who's coming through if I were to think of it through that lens.
Yeah. You just become the sleuth of your own life.
Yes, I love that. That's a beautiful way to put it. Well, I wanted to let everyone know the link to the free masterclass is going to be below this video. So you can click on that and get access right away and start working with Dr. Megan Rose, who is amazing and very magical. And I'm so blessed to have you here with us in the conversation today. So thank you so much for coming onto the show.
Thank you so much. Yeah. And if people want to learn more, they can go to my website, drmeganrose.com.
Fantastic. And to the audience, I hope you enjoyed this thrilling conversation. Check out her book, Spirit Marriage. It's available on Amazon and anywhere you can buy amazing books.
And some even in bookstores. Imagine that.
All right. And until next time, everyone, stay magical.